Okay. Well, we've talked about China and its neighbors and with their location and China's golden age. Now we're going to talk about the worlds of Christendom. So you have the Eastern Orthodox world, and then you also have the Roman Catholic. So if you remember, there was what was called the Great Schism. That was where the church actually ended up dividing. So the church ended up dividing between the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. Both are very, very similar, and both are basically Catholic. The Eastern Orthodox started to be upset with the ruling and how people were ruling and with some of the corruption. And so they started kind of nitpicking the church and they basically just split. So, where you're going to see most of the Eastern Orthodox Church is in Eastern Europe, but mainly Russia. Mainly Russia. So, let's look at this. So, the Byzantine Empire. So, let's look here. So here's our Byzantine Empire to kind of give you an idea. So right now, where you're going to end up seeing that split, that schism is going to be kind of over here a little bit. Okay, so we've got the schism that happened. This is what it's called, and it is the Great Breakup here. So the Byzantine Empire is going to start declining in about 600. Constantinople is going to end up being founded by Constantine, and Constantinople, if we'll remember, is right here. Get my little pointer. Pointer? I want a pointer. Fireworks? There we go. That's awesome. Okay, so Constantinople is right there. And that is what is founded by Constantine, who ends up being in charge of this entire empire. Okay. He ends up taking over. So, what's going to happen is you're going to have this whole idea of Caesar Papism. Now, Caesar Papism is kind of almost like what you would think. So, Caesar was king, and we know that that was the name for king. Papism kind of comes with the papal or pope. And so basically the idea of Caesaropapism is the idea that there is the ruler is king and pope. So it is a God appointed ruler. Where can we see some of the similarities in that? In divine right and in the mandate of heaven in China. So here's where we see some things that are very similar to this. And so Constantinople, and it's going to be created in Christianity. It's going to be Christian. And the whole idea of this is going to be brought about also through the idea of Caesaropapism. The Crusades are the four major crusades that were holy wars against Muslims. So remember that the Muslim church was coming in and the Christian church. So you have the Muslims coming in from down in here, right? And then you have the Christians here, and they're going out to try and stop the Muslims from coming in and taking over. Kind of a fight for the church. And so what you end up having here are these holy wars. And they're going to cause a lot of tensions, and they're going to make a lot of things worse between the East, which again would be more of the Kiev and Rus, the Russian area, and Rome. A lot of the differences, Kiev and Rus is going to become a main area of Eastern Orthodox Christianity. Let's go back to this here. Oh, and we don't have Kiev and Rus on here, so I apologize. To find us another map with that on there to show you. But Kiev and Rus is going to be a Russian city, and it's going to be very important for culture and development. They're going to borrow a lot from the Byzantine Empire, and at the end of the Byzantine Empire, because of the Crusades, the Turks are going to end up bringing down the empire. The Byzantine Empire, also now known as the Ottoman Empire, what it will be known after that. This is St. Mark's Basilica. This was consecrated in 1094. This is an ornate cathedral. It is located in Venice, Italy. It is a classic example of Byzantine architecture. So, a lot of churches represented perhaps the greatest achievements of the Byzantine Empire. And so, the Byzantine Empire is going to be known for its culture. That is going to be one of the biggest takeaways from the Byzantine Empire. That and its spread of culture and everything along the trade routes. Okay, this is all going to lead to a definite fragmented political landscape in Western Europe. So, Western Christendom is going to be all about Europe. It is going to help facilitate trade, and it's going to spread through trade. What you're going to see in Western Christendom is you're going to see this feudalism and serfdom. This is going to be very similar to Roman style slavery. They're going to be tied to the land. They end up being to where they have to work the land. They can't ever get out of that system. European states are going to pop up, and this is going to be a European states versus Eastern civilizations. And so you're going to see a lot of the civilizations of the East. And the reason they're not states is because you still have a lot of nomadic territory out there. And so it's going to be civilizations versus European states, European countries that have been brought together. The Roman Catholic Church is going to be the one unifier of Europe. Without the Catholic Church, you are not going to see unity in Europe. So the Catholic Church does end up unifying Europe. There is not going to be any political unity because at the time, several people are going to be very upset with how the church has more land. And you're going to see this later in France, where you have the three estates and you have the French actually getting upset because you have the first estate, who's the clergy, the second estate, which is the nobles, and everybody else falls underneath that. And the third estate is everybody who pays taxes. And so you're not going to see a lot of political unity under the Catholic Church. You're going to actually see more tension because of that later. So because of the Crusades, so if you look at this image, you have to look and see, what do you see? So let's look at this image together. You have castle walls and bows and arrows aiming up, bows and arrows aiming down. So you have a war here. Let's look at what we see. These are men that have, looks like, let me scroll in here. Going by clothing, always a good thing to look at. Looks like these are the Europeans. These are the Muslims. It looks like a king is kind of stuck here in the middle. I mean, it looks like you have somebody up here with pointing to a crest, possibly trying to establish what is going on there. This painting, sorry about that. This painting is illustrating the Christian seizure of Jerusalem during the First Crusade. The crowned figure in the center is Godefroy de Bouillon, and a French knight and nobleman who played a prominent role in the attack and was briefly known as the King of Jerusalem. So kind of giving you an idea of what some of the Crusades may have looked like. Here are the Turks storming the walls of Constantinople. And remember, we know that they do end up winning. The Turks create the Ottoman Empire, and when Constantinople ends up becoming Turkey and Istanbul. This is showing you the Holy Roman Empire, okay? Kind of giving you an idea of what that is. So here's Novgorod and Moscow. This is our Russian part, and this is also going to be your Eastern Orthodox, okay? This is where you're going to see that. Mongol Khanates, Poland and Lithuania. You know how I said we have states here? So these are very divided states. And over here, we still have some nomadic territories right here. And so, again, this is why these would be considered that. instead. Okay. Um, Europe is going to continue to grow. So Europe goes through a lot. They get a lot of stuff from China and from India. They are very big into trade, even though they are at the end of the trading route. They're going to have what is called the High Middle Ages between 1000 and 1300. You're going to see a lot of technological breakthroughs like the wheeled plow, reliance on animals, iron horseshoes, effective collars, crop rotation. When you have all of these new technologies, one thing we can always say is when you have new technologies, you've got more time for people to not be working as hard. And when people don't work as hard and they have a surplus of food and they have extra free time, you always see a population growth. That is always going to happen. So during this time, it's going to boom. Now, notice the date to 1300. Something very important is going to happen at that point. Okay, so during this time period, you're going to end up seeing right here, this time period here, the reason it's going to end is because you're going to end up seeing one very important thing that's going to happen that's going to wipe out the population, and that's going to be the bubonic plague. Okay, also spread through trade routes from China. So population's going to grow. In Europe and Asia, there's all kinds of technology. Technology is usually very good for population growths. Roles are going to change for men and women. So before this, religion had given women an alternative to married life. So women could end up being nuns and giving their life to God as well. Or they could just spend a lot of time in the church and dedicate time to helping the church. Women were considered unclean because of their menstruation and being basically sexual temperists, which required them to be under male control. And so what you're going to see is you're going to see this whole idea also change quite a bit. So women before did have a role, an alternative role to married life, but they're going to be seen as unclean. So that's not going to bode well for them. Women end up throughout time and throughout history changing continuity. One of the continuities is that women have always fought to have more roles. And some of the changes that have occurred is they've slowly gotten more autonomy throughout time. We talked about technology just a second ago. Europeans were fascinated with technology, and their religious motivation for investigating the world are apparent in the 13th century portrayal of God as a divine engineer laying out the world with a huge compass. So a lot of people would say, going by the Big Bang Theory, you will see people that the scientists will say, oh, it was a Big Bang Theory. And the religious will say, well, it was, but only because God allowed it to be that way. So there's the two arguments that you can have. Now, this is showing God as the divine creator. Now, if you'll notice, it is going to lead to some very important times like the Enlightenment, which are going to end up being a huge, huge importance because that's going to lead to new ways of thinking, which are going to lead to a lot of revolutions. And that's going to be a big part of what we talk about. So Western Europe. So when we look at why they had the Crusades, remember, they were trying to save Christendom from Islam and the Jewish faith. They wanted to spread over land and sea. They wanted so much. In reality, there was very little impact from the Crusades, actually, politically or religiously. The interesting thing was the biggest impact from the Crusades was the spread of clothing and the colors, just to show you some of that. That's some of the biggest spread because they get those bright colors from India and from China. So that was kind of interesting because that was probably some of the biggest things that came from the Crusades was a little bit of spread of religion, but not really. Mostly it was a spread of ideas and technology and items, consumer goods. So that's kind of cool. The Renaissance is going to end up changing intellectual thought. So the Renaissance is going to pop up. So you have all of these different things kind of going on here. You've got people kind of focusing on the church, and then you have another group kind of thinking, maybe I'm more important. Maybe I could actually go to church. Maybe I could go to heaven on my own. Maybe I don't need to focus on life after. And so you have what is called the European Renaissance, which is the rebirth of art and learning. So here is a European university in the Middle Ages. I just think it's funny because when you look at this, here's a school. So you've got, hold on, zooming in too much. You've got this guy up here, the teacher. You have a kid over here sleeping. Not really a kid. You've got people over here talking. I feel like, and then you have people here that are actually listening and taking notes. Another guy over here sleeping. Probably, I guess you could say things haven't changed too much, huh? So, here we have, this is a piece, and it's kind of interesting. So this here, I wish I could try and scroll into this, bring it a little closer. So this is going to be, this is actually in your textbook, which is great, but I want to go over this a little bit with you. So you have like the whole idea of, you're going to see a little bit of different religions impacted in this, and this picture is not as clear as I was hoping it would be. Okay, so you may have to look this one up in your textbook and kind of get the idea of what's going on. Okay, so we'll have to look that one up on the textbook. We might discuss that one a little bit further in class. So if we look at Europe, so here is Europe, 1050 AD. So this is kind of, it's before the Renaissance, but it's kind of like, you kind of see things starting to change. Here's Kiev and Rus. We talked about that a second ago, and I said I didn't have a good picture of it to give you the exact location. So this is Kiev and Rus. Actually, Rus was like right in here all by itself, and then it grew. Here's the Holy Roman Empire, which obviously is not as big as it once was. Here's France. Remember that Spain had Christians and Muslims because they end up having this huge cultural blow up here. And I mean blow up in a good way. They've got so much art and architecture, and Christians and Muslims actually lived together, and it wasn't that big of a deal. I mean, it was a little bit of a deal, but nothing like what you would assume it to be. Here's the Byzantine Empire, and here, so you've got the Muslim Caliphate, and it's kind of like coming and encroaching right on Christianity. And so they're trying to keep that from happening. Where is my sound?
Videos. We've been flying around the world trying to figure out what's going on in the world between the years 1200 and 1450, and today we get to Europe. So let's get it. Now, let's start by reaching backwards into European history just a bit. So the western half of the Roman Empire fell in 476, but the empire itself continued for another 1,000 years under the auspices in the east of the Byzantine Empire. And so between 476 and 1000, Europe was basically fractured and divided culturally and politically into little tribal kingdoms that were constantly at war with one another for dominance. And if you want a word for how this continent was organized politically and socially during this time, I think we can come up with one, and I'll say feudalism. Now, feudalism is a system of mutual obligations that exists between the classes. What do you mean, Heimler? Well, let me explain it up real nice for you. There were essentially 4 social layers in society. On top, there was a king, and the king granted land to the next level down, which is to say, the lords, in exchange for their service and tribute. The lords contracted the folks in the next level down, the knights, to protect their land and in some cases go to war. At the bottom of all this is the peasantry. These folks worked the land of the lords in exchange for providing the lords with the produce of the land. The peasants were called serfs, and while they weren't slaves in the sense that we think of today, they were certainly not free. Their lives were tied to the land, and since they were under the authority of the lord, they had to have the lord's permission to marry and to travel. And if a serf had a baby, well, then they added a new serf to the family. Now, this span of years used to be known as the Dark Ages, because during this time in Europe, trade declined, people's standard of living living declined, intellectual life declined. But from about 1000 to 1450, the sun began to rise again, and this is called the High Middle Ages. And one of the major changes going on during the High Middle Ages is the rise of more powerful monarchs. So kings were able to consolidate more land and more power during this time, and that means that power shifted away from the feudal lords to the kings. And you've got basically two ways in which kings were successful in consolidating power. First, they established huge bureaucracies that were able to carry out their will. And second, they conscripted metric buttloads of standing armies. And both of these entities were directly answerable to the king. Therefore, power. But by the 13th century, power began to shift back towards the noble classes yet again. And this transfer of power was facilitated by the signing of the Magna Carta in 1215. So the Magna Carta, which was a document largely pushed through by the noble class, officially guaranteed rights to the nobles, like the right to a jury trial and the right to all free citizens to own and inherit property. And a few years later, in 1265, power further shifted into the hands of the nobles with the establishment of the English Parliament, which was a body that represented the interests of the noble class. Now, in the middle of all this European change, one of the continuities that ran through it all was the Roman Catholic Church. It was during this time that the Catholic Church established the first universities in Europe, and therefore most of the philosophers and the thinkers and the educators were religious men in those days. And artists, too, were beholden to the church. Much of the art produced during this time was heavy with Christian themes, and they did this to provide visual education to the illiterate peasantry who couldn't read about the good news of Jesus Christ for themselves. Now, as a result of the rise of these more powerful monarchs, there came something of a power struggle between church and state. So while these regional kingdoms were still pretty much the norm, the Roman Catholic Church was pretty settled in its position of providing cultural and intellectual unity across Europe. But these more powerful kings began to threaten that hold. And one response to this is the Crusades. Starting in the 12th century, the Pope and the bishops urged Christians to take up their swords and reclaim Jerusalem from the infidel Muslims. And if they did, getting into heaven was going to be pretty easy. So go stab a couple infidels in the face and you basically earned your forgiveness. And whatever other cultural effects this had, it surely had the effect of shifting the people's allegiance from the monarchs to the Roman Catholic Church. Okay, let's talk about economic and social change that happened during this time. In the late 13th century, an Italian by the name of Marco Polo left his home to explore and found himself all the way in China at the court of Kublai Khan. Polo wrote an account of his travels and it sold like crazy in Europe, and it opened Europeans' imagination to the exotic culture and wealth of the Far East. And this led to innovations in map making and cartography so that it would be easier to get back there. Back in normal life, a new economic class started to rise during this time, the middle class, or if you want to sound more pompous in your life, the bourgeoisie. These were the people who were not as rich as the nobles, but not as poor as the peasants. And they included shopkeepers and merchants and small landowners. Also, not to be forgotten, there was a little ice age during this time. For a few years, temperatures gradually fell, leading to a sharp decrease in agricultural productivity. And decreased agricultural productivity leads to a declining population. And a declining population leads to less trade. And less trade leads to sinking economic conditions. So that's rough, but don't worry, they got out of it. After the 1300s, the Europeans experienced the bright optimism of the Renaissance. The word itself means rebirth, so something new wasn't coming into being, something old was being reborn. And what was that? It was the rebirth of ancient Greek and Roman art and culture and literature. During this time, some of our world's most magnificent pieces of art were created, like Dante's Divine Comedy and Chaucer's Canterbury Tales and the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, and on and on and on. And that's not even close to everything that was going on in Europe from 1200 to 1450, but that's all you really need to know for the AP World History exam, and I'll see you in the next one. If you found this video helpful, then subscribe.
Okay. And that is the Worlds of Christendom. And the next one will be the Worlds of Islam, the Civilizations of America, and we'll do a short recap.